Hello lovers. Eleanor here. Tonight, we will embark on a journey that is stitched together with loneliness, memory, and the kind of courage that makes history tremble. I am sitting here in my little kitchen, the kettle long since cooled, the cat having wandered off to curl on the sofa, and the silence pressing in like a heavy cloak. You know, evenings like this can feel endless when you are 70, with no one to call your name. Sometimes I wonder if the echo of my footsteps is the only proof I'm still here. Yet it is in these hushed hours, when the world seems to forget you, that I find comfort in voices from the past. And tonight, that voice is Nelson Mandela's. Some call him the father of peace. Others whisper rebel. What a strange contradiction, isn't it? That one man could be both the architect of reconciliation and, in another time, the champion of resistance through fire and sabotage. If you enjoy these journeys through time, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me, what is your favorite historical story? I would love to hear it. Now, settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let's travel back in time with Eleanor. When I close my own eyes, I see it. A dusty South African village in the rolling hills of the Transkei. There, in 1918, a boy named Rolihlahla, his given name, which means troublemaker, came into the world. What a name for a child, don't you think? As if destiny itself had whispered into his cradle, foretelling a life that would shake empires. I imagine his mother's arms, strong and tired, holding him against a backdrop of colonial rule where black South Africans were already pressed into the margins of their own homeland. Mandela's childhood was steeped in Xhosa tradition. His father, a counselor to the Thembu king, instilled pride in heritage, though he died when Mandela was only 9. I picture that boy, standing outside a hut, his small fists clenched as the world stole his father away. And here is where the paradox begins. Grief became a strange kind of tutor. He was taken in by the regent of the Thembu people, growing up in a household of tribal politics, storytelling, and deep cultural values. Imagine it. A child already trained to see beyond his own little heartache into the greater pulse of a community. As I recount this, I feel a sting of recognition. When I lost my husband to COVID, it was as if someone had ripped the center out of my chest. And yet, in the weeks that followed, my neighbors, those dear souls, began to check in, bring bread, asking after me. Community filled the silence. Perhaps Mandela's earliest lesson was the same. That when life carves out a wound, it sometimes leaves space for something larger than yourself to step in. He was sent to Helltown, a Methodist school, where discipline was strict and order was prized. The colonial education system was designed to mold black students into compliant laborers. Yet, paradoxically, it also opened doors to new ideas. There, Mandela read Shakespeare, recited speeches, and was exposed to stories of leaders who defied tyrants. How curious, don't you think? The very system meant to tame him became the spark of rebellion. I often imagine him at Fort Hare University, a young man with bright eyes and a restless spirit. He and his peers debated justice, dignity, and equality in classrooms that buzzed with discontent. For refusing to accept rules that silenced students, Mandela was expelled. Expelled. A punishment for daring to believe his voice mattered. That detail always makes me smile a little. For isn't that the seed of greatness? The audacity to say, I will not sit quietly. Here is the delicate question. Was he already on the road to being a hero? Or simply a boy angry at injustice? Historians still debate this. Perhaps greatness is less a lightning strike and more a slow burn. A steady collection of small defiances that add up until the world can no longer look away. I find myself wondering, as I sip this lukewarm tea, how many of us ever truly recognize the crossroads when they come? Mandela must have felt, at least once, that he was standing at the threshold of something he could not turn back from. And maybe that's the lesson for us all. Whether in love, in loss, or in history. We rarely see the moment our lives pivot until we've already walked through the door. It is late. And the silence feels heavier tonight. I find myself staring at the lamp on the table. Its light haloing the dust that dances lazily in the air. Loneliness. Ah. It settles into the corners like cobwebs. But if my apartment has become a kind of prison of silence, then perhaps I can understand a little of what Mandela felt when the walls closed in on him. Not just later, behind bars, but even earlier, when the iron cage of apartheid began tightening around his people. By the time Mandela arrived in Johannesburg in the early 1940s, South Africa was already a land split in two. White minority rule stood like a fortress, and black South Africans were relegated to shadows. Laws dictated where they could live, whom they could marry, and even what doors they could enter. Can you imagine? To be told that your skin alone determined your worth? Sometimes I look at my own reflection. This aging face. These lines. And think how cruel it is that society measures us by appearances. But for Mandela and his generation, it was not just vanity or age. It was survival. Mandela studied law. Of all things. In a world that refused to see him as fully human. He became the country's first black attorney at his firm. Alongside Oliver Tambo. I can picture their small office. A desk stacked with papers. Worn chairs. Anxious clients. People came to them broken by evictions. Pass laws. Brutality. The two young lawyers gave them something rare. A voice. I like to think of them as midwives. Helping ordinary South Africans birth dignity in a place that tried so hard to choke it out. Yet the legal road was narrow. In 1944, Mandela joined the African National Congress Youth League. He was restless, passionate, and, let us be honest, not always patient. The ANC at that time was conservative, favoring petitions and appeals. But the Youth League? They wanted mass action, civil disobedience, a movement that shook the very ground. Isn't it always the young who dare to believe change is possible? The Defiance Campaign of 1952 was one of their first great acts of courage. Thousands deliberately broke apartheid laws, entering whites-only areas, burning passes, inviting arrest. Mandela was at the forefront, organizing volunteers. The government responded with brutality, arrests, whips. Yet for the first time, black South Africans saw the power of collective defiance. History often shifts not with one loud bang, but with many voices, steady and insistent. But here lies the paradox again. Mandela, the man so often remembered for peace, was already learning that peace alone would not move stone walls. Arrests piled up. Trials consumed his days. And the Sharpeville massacre of 1960, where police gunned down 69 peaceful protesters, snapped something inside him. Can peace survive when blood runs so freely? That is the question that tormented him, and perhaps still torments history itself. I pause here, looking at my teacup. The dregs cold at the bottom. Sometimes people call me gentle. Too gentle. Even naive. When my husband was alive, he used to laugh that I'd rather write a letter than shout in anger. But I know what it is to break inside. To realize that kindness alone cannot always protect you. That moment, when you cross from patient hope to determined resistance, is terrifying. Mandela knew it. And I suspect many of us, in smaller, quieter ways, know it too. By the early 1960s, Mandela and the ANC had concluded that armed struggle was inevitable. Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation, was born. Sabotage, not murder, was their tactic. Explosives planted at empty buildings. Attacks on symbols of apartheid power. The oppressor only understands one language, Mandela once said. Was he right? Or was he stepping onto a path that would shadow him forever? Historians still debate it. As I sit here tonight, I can't help but wonder. Was he a freedom fighter? Or a rebel with fire in his veins? And can the two be separated? Perhaps we should ask instead. What would we have done had we lived where hope seemed crushed under a white boot? The night deepens, and the walls of this apartment seem to lean closer. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I imagine what silence must have sounded like on Robben Island. So much harsher than the stillness here. My solitude is chosen, though often painful. Mandela's was imposed. And merciless. In 1962, he was arrested and sentenced to 5 years for leaving the country illegally and inciting strikes. But that was only the beginning. The Rivonia trial of 1964 sealed his fate. Life imprisonment. Mandela, along with his comrades, stood accused of sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. The evidence was damning. But his speech in court became legend. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society, he declared, fully expecting a death sentence. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. Imagine the courage it takes to stare your executioner in the eye and gift them with words that would outlive even your own heartbeat. They sent him to Robben Island, a barren rock in the Atlantic, where the wind itself seemed determined to erode hope. His cell, barely large enough for a cot in a bucket. Hard labor in a limestone quarry left his eyes damaged, his lungs scarred. Guards treated prisoners with cruelty that stripped them of dignity. Thin rations, endless toil, and the petty humiliations that gnawed at the soul. And yet, Mandela endured. He studied. He wrote. He turned that island into what some have called the University of Robben Island. Prisoners taught each other history, politics, languages. Letters smuggled out became lifelines, carrying scraps of wisdom to the world beyond. He cultivated a garden, too, coaxing life from the unforgiving soil. Isn't that something? Even in prison, he planted seeds. I sometimes look at my own balcony garden, my pots of basil and lavender, and think of Mandela kneeling in the dust, coaxing green shoots from the ground. Perhaps hope, like plants, simply refuses to die if watered with enough patience. Still, hope was fragile. The outside world barely knew of his face. Photographs were banned. For decades, the regime tried to make him a ghost. And yet, sometimes ghosts are louder than the living. His absence spoke. His silence thundered. Each year he remained behind bars. His legend grew. But let us not romanticize too quickly. Mandela was not immune to despair. Fellow inmates recalled his quiet moments, staring into nothing, the weight of endless years pressing down. 27 years. Can you picture that? For me, the 3 years since I lost my husband have felt like an eternity. The apartment is too quiet. The evenings too long. I fill them with books, letters, old recipes, anything to distract the ache. How must it have felt for Mandela? Measuring life by the scrape of prison doors, the clatter of chains, the endless tally of sunsets behind bars. And still, his heart changed in prison. He came to believe that even the jailers, yes, even the ones who cursed him, were human beings trapped in a system of hate. He studied their language, Afrikaans. He greeted them with courtesy. Slowly, even grudgingly, some guards respected him. Isn't it extraordinary? To be denied freedom, yet still choose generosity? There is one image that always stays with me. Mandela breaking stones in the blazing sun. His hands blistered and raw. Dust in his hair. But his back unbowed. That posture. It is the posture of defiance. But also of patience. He could not leave Robben Island. But he refused to let Robben Island consume him. As I sip what's left of my tea, I ask myself, is patience a form of rebellion? To endure without breaking. To wait without surrendering. Perhaps that, too, is resistance. There is a draft of wind outside my window tonight, rattling the panes as though the world wants to be heard. Funny, isn't it? Sounds like history itself. Always knocking. Never quiet for long. Mandela may have been hidden away on Robben Island. But beyond those walls, the world was making noise. By the 1970s and 80s, his imprisonment had become more than just a South African issue. It was a global symbol of injustice. Across Europe, in the Americas, even in small towns I used to teach about, people marched with placards. Free Nelson Mandela. The man who was not allowed to be seen had his face painted on banners. Students sang songs in his name. Musicians wrote anthems. I still remember hearing Free Nelson Mandela on the radio. That jaunty tune carrying a plea as sharp as any protest. It struck me. Sometimes history is not whispered by scholars but shouted by voices on the street. Governments began to act. The United Nations condemned apartheid. Economic sanctions struck South Africa's economy. Sports boycotts cut the nation off from international competitions. Rugby, South Africa's pride, was no longer welcomed on the global stage. And for a society so obsessed with status and recognition, that was humiliation. Imagine being told you cannot play, cannot trade, cannot join, because of the way you treat your own people. But here's the question that gnawed at many. Did this international pressure truly hasten Mandela's eventual release? Or was it the internal resistance within South Africa itself? Historians still debate. Some say the outside world's outrage built a moral cage around the apartheid regime. Others argue it was the relentless strikes, boycotts, and protests by ordinary South Africans. People who risked prison, beatings, even death, that finally forced change. Perhaps it was both. I cannot help but compare it to the smaller, quieter acts of solidarity in my own life. When my husband died, neighbors left food at my door. Strangers mailed condolence cards. They could not undo my grief, but they lightened its weight. That is what global solidarity must have felt like to those suffering under apartheid. A recognition that their pain mattered. That their voices echoed far beyond their borders. Still, Mandela's name carried controversy. Some branded him a terrorist. After all, the ANC had not limited itself to speeches. They had chosen sabotage. Even in the 1980s, leaders in powerful nations wrestled with this contradiction. Was Mandela a freedom fighter or a criminal? Could a man committed to peace also condone bombs? The paradox unsettles me still. I think of how easily society labels and dismisses. How quickly one person's rebel becomes another's saint. As the years stretched, Mandela aged in prison. His hair whitening. His body bearing scars. But his stature grew taller in absence than any podium could grant him. By the late 1980s, whispers became roars. The world demanded to see the man whose face was nearly forgotten. There's something poignant in this thought. Sometimes silence is louder than a speech. Absence more visible than presence. Mandela's long invisibility turned him into a myth. A vessel into which millions poured their hopes. And as I sit in my chair tonight, listening to the restless wind, I wonder, what do we, in our ordinary lives, pour into silence? Do we turn it into despair? Or into resolve? The winter of 1982 found Mandela moved from Robben Island to Pollsmoor Prison, a facility closer to Cape Town. On paper, it was an improvement. Less harsh labor. A room with more light. The faint possibility of visitors. But Mandela himself remarked that Pollsmoor felt like being buried alive. Cut off not just by walls, but by layers of secrecy. Why the move? Officially, it was his health. He was older now. His lungs weak from years in the quarry's dust. His eyesight failing from the glare of white rock under the sun. But the deeper reason was politics. The apartheid regime knew Mandela had become too symbolic to be left in obscurity. At Pollsmoor, the government could control access, tighten the circle, perhaps even coax him into dialogue. And dialogue did begin. Though in whispers. Through guarded corridors. And with men who once vowed never to negotiate with terrorists, secret meetings were arranged. Mandela, still a prisoner, found himself sitting across from high-ranking officials of the very system that caged him. Imagine that. The prisoner and the jailer talking, each carrying the weight of history on their shoulders. It was a paradox that still unsettles me. A man stripped of freedom was suddenly at the heart of political bargaining. I sometimes think of my own life. After my husband's passing, neighbors who had never once crossed my doorstep came to speak, offering condolences. It was as though grief forced conversations that ordinary life had never demanded. In Mandela's case, suffering created a bridge where ideology had long built walls. Those secret talks revealed the pragmatism in Mandela. He was no longer the fiery young man who plotted sabotage. Age, reflection, and perhaps the sheer endurance of time had honed his resolve. He sought not revenge but transition. A path that might spare South Africa the civil war so many feared. Yet this turn toward negotiation was not universally welcomed. Within the ANC and the broader resistance movement, whispers of betrayal began. Could Mandela, isolated for decades, truly speak for the masses still fighting, bleeding, and dying in the townships? Or was he being softened, co-opted by the regime? The world outside did not know these discussions were happening. But among those who sensed a shift, the question of legitimacy loomed. Historians argue endlessly. Was Mandela's willingness to negotiate visionary or naive? Did it pave the way for a peaceful transition? Or did it risk diluting the revolution? I find myself torn. It reminds me of teaching about revolutions in class. How every great change carries its moderates and radicals, each side believing they alone hold the key to justice. Pollsmoor was not just a prison. It was a crucible. Within its walls, the image of Mandela the martyr began to blur into Mandela the statesman. He read voraciously, studied Afrikaans, the language of his oppressors, so he could speak to them not as an enemy, but as a peer. There's something almost poetic in that. Mastering the tongue of those who denied your humanity. Not to imitate them, but to dismantle the distance. As I sit here tonight, alone in my little apartment, I think of the loneliness Mandela must have felt in Pollsmoor. Surrounded by guards, courted by power, doubted by his comrades. Loneliness, I've learned, does not always come from silence. Sometimes it comes from being the only one holding a fragile bridge between two warring worlds. And so, the prisoner who once symbolized rebellion was being reshaped into the figure who would one day symbolize reconciliation. But the road ahead was still long, still uncertain, still lined with suspicion and bloodshed. It leaves us to ask: can a man negotiate peace while still chained? Or must he first be free to truly speak? By the mid to late 1980s, South Africa felt like a nation on the edge of eruption. The air was heavy with smoke from burning tires in the townships. The streets echoed with chants of protest. And the world beyond its borders grew louder in condemnation. Sanctions were tightening, boycotts spreading, and the image of apartheid, once defended so stubbornly, was unraveling before global eyes. Mandela, still confined but no longer invisible, watched these tides from within Pollsmoor's walls. Newspapers were censored, visitors restricted, yet whispers carried the truth. Young people in Soweto were rising, unions were striking, and even some within the ruling white establishment whispered of reform. The government's fear was palpable. Fear not only of the black majority, but of collapse, of international isolation, of a future they could no longer control. In this turbulence, Mandela's role shifted again. No longer merely a prisoner of conscience, he became a symbol both sides tried to shape. The state hoped to mold him into a moderate voice willing to soothe the storm. The resistance demanded he remain uncompromising, a beacon of their fiery struggle. I think of those nights when I lie in bed, the silence of this apartment pressing down. My late husband's absence feels like a kind of exile too. Not imposed by a government, but by fate itself. Mandela's isolation, though political, must have carried the same sting. Knowing the world outside burned with urgency while he was confined to stone walls and guarded gates. Loneliness in moments of history is never just personal. It becomes collective, woven into the lives of thousands who wait for your voice. By 1985, President P.W. Botha offered Mandela conditional release. Freedom, if he renounced violence. It was meant to be a clever gesture, a way to fracture the movement and cast Mandela as obstinate should he refuse. Yet Mandela's reply, delivered through his daughter at a public rally, thundered louder than any speech he could have made in person. I cannot and will not give any undertaking at a time when I and you, the people, are not free. Can you imagine the weight of that decision? To stay in prison rather than compromise. To endure another day. Another year. When freedom was a signature away. It's the kind of choice that makes me shiver even now. Would I have had such resolve if it meant giving up the chance to walk again in the garden? To hear my husband's laughter? To feel the brush of a child's hand on mine? History often looks clean in hindsight. But at the time, these decisions tear at the soul. And yet, Mandela also knew the world was shifting. Secret talks expanded, cautiously, into broader channels. Government officials who once spoke only of suppression began to ask what a transition might look like. The ANC, still banned, carried its fight in exile in underground cells. But the idea of negotiation was no longer taboo. It was as though both sides, bruised and bloodied, sensed that endless conflict could not last. Historians today debate whether it was the sanctions, the street protests, or Mandela's moral authority that finally cracked apartheid. Perhaps it was all of them, weaving together like strands of rope that finally pulled the regime down. For me, the fascination lies in the balance. How a man behind bars could shape events as powerfully as the multitudes marching in the streets. In those years, Mandela's stature grew larger than life. He was no longer merely a leader of the ANC but a figure whose shadow stretched across continents. Yet with that came a risk. Could the man live up to the myth? Could a flesh and blood human, with flaws and compromises, carry the burden of millions' hopes? That, I think, is the cruel trick of history. We elevate leaders into saints or demons, forgetting they were once as human as you and me. As I sip my evening tea and listen to the rain outside, I wonder. When Mandela lay down at night in Pollsmoor, did he dream as an icon? Or simply as an old man longing for the touch of his wife, the voices of his children, the warmth of home? The late 1980s were years of fire and whispers, of marches and secret handshakes. South Africa was changing, though painfully, unevenly, and with blood still staining its soil. And Mandela, though still a prisoner, was slowly becoming the axis around which it all turned. By the late 1980s, the walls of apartheid were finally cracking. The protests in the streets grew louder, the sanctions bit deeper, and even among white South Africans, a quiet recognition spread. Change was inevitable. The government could not keep millions of people in chains forever. Nor could it silence the name of Mandela, which had become a rallying cry whispered in homes, shouted in rallies, and written across banners in cities around the world. Mandela himself was moved in 1988 from Pollsmoor to Victor Verster Prison, a more lenient facility near Paarl. Compared to Robben Island's iron discipline or Pollsmoor's walls, Victor Verster almost felt unreal. He lived in a small house with a garden, allowed to receive visits more freely. At first glance, it might seem like comfort after so many years of deprivation. But I often wonder if this transition felt strange, even cruel in its own way. To be given a taste of freedom, yet still know the gates remained locked. When I sit here alone in my kitchen, the kettle hissing in the window fogging from steam, I sometimes think of Mandela in that modest house. Did he walk in circles at night, rehearsing the words he would one day speak to the world? Did he pace the garden, feeling the soil under his feet, and imagine the soil of a free South Africa? Loneliness has a peculiar way of sharpening dreams. In those final years before his release, Mandela's meetings with government officials intensified. F.W. de Klerk had risen to power, and unlike his predecessors, he began to see negotiations not as weakness but as survival. Still, the choice was perilous. Giving power to the ANC could mean chaos, violence, even retribution. Holding on to apartheid meant certain collapse. It was, in essence, a gamble for the soul of a nation. I often picture their meetings. The older prisoner with graying hair and a steady gaze. And the nervous government men in their suits. Shuffling papers. Watching him with a mixture of fear and respect. They must have felt the weight of centuries pressing on that room. It was more than politics. It was history staring back at them in Mandela's eyes. And then came February 11, 1990. After 27 years, Mandela walked free. The world held its breath. And millions of South Africans, crowded around radios and televisions, wept. His hand in Winnie's. His fist raised high. It became one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. But I can't help but think of what must have gone through his mind as he stepped through that prison gate. Joy. Surely. Relief. But also fear. Perhaps. The myth of Mandela had grown so large in his absence. Could he, a mortal man, live up to it? Could he unite a fractured nation, soothe the anger, prevent the country from plunging into civil war? Sometimes, when I leave this apartment and step into the daylight, I feel a fraction of that anxiety. After days of silence, solitude, and memory, the noise of the world can feel overwhelming. Mandela's re-entry into freedom was not just about sunlight on his face. It was about facing a world that had waited, changed, and demanded more from him than from almost any other leader in history. His freedom was not the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one fraught with expectations, hopes, and dangers. And as I sip my tea, I wonder, would I have had the courage to lift my head so high after all those years? Mandela's release was not the end of the storm. It was the eye of it. Outside the gates, South Africa trembled. The apartheid system was collapsing. But it was far from gone. Violence scarred the townships. Political factions clashed. The nation seemed ready to ignite. And at the center of it all stood Nelson Mandela. A man who had walked out of prison into history's harshest spotlight. I often think of those first speeches he gave. The ones carried live across the world. His voice was measured. Not triumphant. He called for peace. For restraint. For negotiations. And in doing so, he showed something remarkable. He was not just a symbol anymore. He was a strategist. A statesman. A reconciler. I imagine the weight pressing down on him. Heavier than prison bars. The weight of millions of lives hanging on his words. Negotiations with the government began almost immediately. They were fragile. Halting. Often poisoned by mistrust. The African National Congress pushed for majority rule, while the National Party feared being swallowed whole. There were walkouts. Deadlocks. Threats. In the streets, people continued to die. Sometimes in clashes with police. Sometimes in bloody conflicts between rival groups. As I sit here, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in my quiet kitchen, I think of Mandela at those negotiating tables. Surrounded by papers, maps, and men who had once called him a terrorist. He had to keep his temper cool. Perhaps he remembered the years of patience on Robben Island. The chess games with time. The steady discipline. Because negotiations, like prison, require endurance. One of the pivotal moments was his partnership with F.W. de Klerk. The two men could not have been more different. The prisoner and the president. The black revolutionary and the white Afrikaner. And yet, together, they steered South Africa toward its first democratic elections. Their relationship was never warm. They argued fiercely, accused each other of betrayal, sometimes nearly broke the talks altogether. But history, in its irony, tied their names forever. In 1993, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded jointly to Mandela and de Klerk. Some applauded. Others scoffed. Could a man who had defended apartheid truly stand alongside Mandela as a peacemaker? The debate still lingers. But perhaps that prize was less about rewarding purity and more about recognizing the fragile miracle they had managed together. When the election finally came in April 1994, the world once again held its breath. For the first time, Black South Africans could vote. Lines stretched for miles, winding through towns and villages. People stood for hours, patient, determined, many weeping as they marked their ballots. One woman was said to be nearly 100 years old, carried on a stretcher so she could cast her vote. Mandela, now 75, cast his ballot too. And when the results were announced, it was official. He was the new president of South Africa. I remember watching that footage. Years later, alone in my living room with the cat curled at my feet. There was something almost biblical about it. The prisoner who had risen, not to avenge, but to unite. And I wondered, how many of us, after such suffering, could resist the urge to punish? The truth is, leadership is not only about vision. It is about restraint. Mandela chose not to rule with bitterness but with reconciliation. He could not erase the pain of apartheid, but he could guide his nation away from vengeance. That decision, I think, is what made him extraordinary. And yet, even as I admire it, I also reflect on my own small life. In loneliness, it is tempting to nurse old wounds, to let resentment grow. Watching Mandela step into power, I ask myself, if he could forgive a nation, why do I struggle to forgive the small hurts of my past? The presidency of Nelson Mandela was both luminous and fraught. To the world, it was the triumph of human dignity. To South Africans, it was the beginning of a fragile experiment. Imagine inheriting a nation bruised, divided, its scars still open. That was Mandela's task when he took the oath in 1994. He walked into the Union buildings in Pretoria, where once black South Africans had been invisible, and stood as the first black president. I can almost see him. Tall, dignified, his fist raised not in defiance anymore, but in greeting. People danced in the streets that day. Hope swelled like a tide. Yet behind the celebrations lay impossible expectations. Could one man heal centuries of injustice? One of his boldest moves was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Instead of Nuremberg-style trials, perpetrators of apartheid crimes were invited to confess in exchange for amnesty. Victims spoke their stories. Their pain-filled courtrooms and television screens. Some South Africans saw it as betrayal. How could murderers walk free? Others saw it as the only way forward. Mandela defended it fiercely, believing that truth could soften vengeance. There was also the famous Rugby World Cup in 1995. Rugby had long been a white man's game, almost a symbol of Afrikaner pride. Mandela, wearing the green Springbok jersey, handed the trophy to Captain Francois Pienaar when South Africa won. It was more than sport. It was theater of unity. And it worked. For one brief moment, the Rainbow Nation felt real. But the challenges were immense. The economy staggered under inequality. Townships still lacked electricity, clean water, jobs. Crime soared. Mandela's government introduced policies to redistribute wealth and improve services. But progress was slow, and frustrations brewed. Even those who adored him began to ask whether love and reconciliation were enough to fix broken systems. I often reflect on the way he aged during those years. Photographs from his presidency show him smiling. But the lines deepen. Leadership carves its own wrinkles, doesn't it? Perhaps he bore not only his own exhaustion but the weight of a nation still learning to live together. Critics emerged. Some accused him of being too forgiving toward whites, not pushing hard enough for economic justice. Others whispered that he leaned too heavily on his advisors, delegating the gritty details of governance. There were scandals among members of his party, the ANC. Mandela's halo could not cover every shadow. And yet, I think of his decision to serve only one term. He could have stayed longer. People would have cheered. But he stepped down in 1999, passing the baton to Thabo Mbeki. That gesture alone taught a lesson rare in politics. Power is not meant to be clung to like a crown. It is borrowed. And it must be returned. When I look at my own quiet evenings, this little kitchen, the ticking clock, the empty chair across from me, I sometimes envy Mandela's world. It was bursting with people, movement, voices. But then I realize, perhaps he too knew solitude. Even in a crowd, leadership can be the loneliest place of all. And maybe that's why I find comfort in his legacy. Because if he could walk through loneliness, bitterness, compromise, and still emerge with a spirit of reconciliation, then perhaps my own small solitude is survivable. When Nelson Mandela stepped away from the presidency in 1999, he left the stage not with bitterness but with dignity. Yet the world did not let him go. Everywhere he traveled, crowds greeted him as if a saint had walked among them. His name became shorthand for hope, resilience, forgiveness. Statues rose in cities far from South Africa. Streets, schools, even children bore his name. But sainthood can be a heavy cloak. As the years passed, debates deepened. Was Mandela too gentle? Too compromising? Some South Africans argued he had spared the white elite, leaving wealth largely untouched. Land remained concentrated. Poverty endured. Younger generations, impatient and fiery, sometimes said, Mandela forgave too much. On the other hand, critics abroad accused him of once being too radical. After all, he had embraced armed resistance in his youth. How curious, isn't it, that one man could be scorned for both extremes? I think of this paradox often. It reminds me of how memory itself is a battlefield. History does not stand still. It is rewritten, argued, fought over, as living people seek meaning in the past. And Mandela, more than most, became a canvas for hopes and disappointments alike. In his twilight years, his body began to falter. Photographs showed him thinner, frailer, though his smile endured. He retreated to his village of Kunu, surrounded by family. Yet even then, the world demanded his presence. Leaders wanted his blessing. Causes sought his endorsement. It is a hard thing to belong to history when you still crave a little quiet. I remember the day of his passing in 2013. Television screens flickered with images of mourners, heads bowed, candles glowing in the night. People sang freedom songs through their tears. And I sat here, In this small room, alone with my tea, watching the world grieve together. It felt strange. Millions connected in sorrow. And yet I was still just one woman in her kitchen. The chair beside her empty. Loss, I suppose, is always a private country. No matter how many others walk it with you. Mandela's legacy is contested. Yes. But it is also enduring. He showed that a life can bend from anger to forgiveness. From rebellion to reconciliation. He proved that leadership is not about perfection but about persistence. About holding the line against despair. And he left us questions that still sting. How do we balance justice with mercy? How do we rebuild without repeating the cycle of vengeance? As I close this journey tonight, I wonder, when the last echoes of our names fade, will we be remembered as rebels, peacemakers, or perhaps something in between? History never gives simple answers. And so, dear listener, we arrive at the end of this long path. We have walked with Mandela through dust and darkness, through prison walls and presidential halls, through cheers and through doubts. We have seen a man both sainted and scarred. A leader who offered light but could not erase every shadow. History, like life, resists tidy endings. Mandela's story is not a fairy tale, but something richer. A reminder that courage can exist alongside compromise. That forgiveness does not erase pain, but it can soften its edges. Perhaps that is the lesson for us. Here in the quiet of night. We do not need to be perfect to change the world. We only need to be steadfast. To keep walking even when the road bends. As I sit here, with the hush of evening wrapping around me, I feel a gentle calm. The loneliness does not vanish. But it feels less sharp when shared with stories like these. May you, too, carry a piece of Mandela's resilience into your dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams filled with the stories of the past.